The pattern that refuses to die. Throughout human history, empires have risen with magnificent glory, spreading their influence across continents and building monuments that still stand today. Yet, despite their military might and cultural achievements, nearly every great empire has eventually crumbled. And when historians dig through the ruins, they find something remarkable. The collapse almost always begins in the same place. Not on the battlefield or in the palace, but in the treasury. Money itself becomes sick, losing its value like a patient wasting away from disease. The Roman Empire debased its coins, mixing cheap metals with silver until citizens refused to accept payment. Spain flooded its economy with stolen gold from the Americas, only to watch prices explode beyond control. Britain printed paper promises it could never keep while fighting wars across the globe. Now, the United States stands at a crossroads, printing trillions of dollars while its citizens wonder if history is repeating itself once more. This is not a story of coincidence, but of a formula, a sequence of decisions that transforms mighty nations into cautionary tales. Understanding this pattern means looking beyond the battles and treaties to see the invisible force that truly determines whether civilizations thrive or collapse. Rome and the birth of currency destruction. In the early days of the Roman Republic, citizens carried coins made of pure silver, called the denarius. Each coin contained real metal with actual value, and people trusted these coins because they knew the government stood behind their quality. Soldiers received their pay in denarii, merchants used them for trade across the Mediterranean, and families saved them knowing their worth would remain stable. But as Rome expanded its borders, the costs of maintaining such a vast empire began to strain the treasury. Legions needed pay, roads required maintenance, and a growing bureaucracy demanded funding. Instead of raising taxes or cutting spending, emperors discovered a tempting shortcut. They began adding copper and other cheap metals to the silver coins, reducing the precious metal content while keeping the same face value. At first, the change was small, barely noticeable to ordinary citizens. A coin that once contained 95% silver might drop to 90%, then 85%. But once this door opened, it never closed. Emperor after emperor continued the practice, each one diluting the currency a bit more. By the time of Emperor Gallienus in the 3rd century, the denarius contained only 5% silver, essentially becoming a copper coin with a thin silver coating that wore off quickly. Citizens noticed, of course. Merchants began refusing the debased coins or demanding more of them for the same goods. A loaf of bread that once cost 1 denarius suddenly cost 5, then 10, then 50. This was not because bread became more valuable, but because money became less valuable. Soldiers rioted when they received worthless pay, border defenses weakened, and Rome's enemies sensed vulnerability. The empire that had conquered the known world found itself defeated not by foreign armies, but by its own monetary decisions. The lesson was clear, though later empires would ignore it. Destroying your currency means destroying your civilization. Spain's Golden Curse. More than 1,000 years after Rome's collapse, Spain stood as Europe's greatest power. Spanish conquistadors had crossed the Atlantic and claimed vast territories in the Americas, discovering wealth beyond imagination. Silver mines in Potosi produced such quantities of precious metal that it seemed Spain would be rich forever. Galleons laden with treasure sailed regularly from the New World to Spanish ports, and the royal treasury overflowed with gold and silver. King Philip II ruled an empire where the sun never set, with territories spanning from the Philippines to Peru. Yet within a few generations, this seemingly invincible empire descended into economic chaos, bankruptcy, and irrelevance. How could such wealth lead to such ruin? The answer reveals another variation of the currency collapse formula. Spain made a fatal assumption that wealth and money are the same thing. The silver flooding into Spain did not represent new productivity or innovation. It was simply metal dug from the ground by forced labor. Spanish leaders believed this treasure made them rich. But wealth comes from the ability to produce goods and services that others want. Spain produced less and less while importing more and more. Why bother developing industries when you could buy everything from other nations with stolen gold? Spanish nobles lived in luxury, purchasing fine cloth from the Netherlands, weapons from Germany, and spices from the East. The silver flowed through Spain like water through a pipe, entering from America and immediately leaving to pay for imports. Meanwhile, inflation began to accelerate. When money supply increases, but the actual goods available do not, prices must rise. A chicken that once cost 1 peso suddenly cost 2 pesos, not because chickens became more valuable, but because pesos became less valuable. Spanish workers found their wages bought less each year, while landowners raised rents to keep pace with inflation.
The government, rather than addressing the root cause, borrowed massive sums from foreign bankers to maintain its lifestyle and fight expensive wars across Europe. The Price Revolution and Imperial Overreach. Historians call the period from 1500 to 1650 the Price Revolution, when inflation ravaged Spain and spread throughout Europe. Prices quadrupled over 150 years, a seemingly modest increase by modern standards, but devastating in an era when people expected prices to remain stable for generations. Spanish kings repeatedly declared bankruptcy, defaulting on their debts in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596. Each default destroyed the savings of creditors and shattered trust in Spanish financial promises. Yet Spain kept fighting wars it could not afford, maintaining armies across Europe to defend Catholic interests and preserve imperial prestige. The famous Spanish tercio infantry units, once invincible, began to suffer from lack of pay and supplies. Soldiers mutinied, sacked cities they were supposed to protect, and deserted in growing numbers. Spain's enemies, particularly the Dutch and English, recognized the opportunity. They built their own economies on manufacturing and trade, rather than gold mines, developing financial innovations like joint stock companies and government bonds. While Spain relied on silver shipments that could be intercepted by pirates or lost in storms, its rivals created sustainable economic systems. The Spanish Netherlands rebelled and eventually won independence, costing Spain one of its wealthiest provinces. The attempted invasion of England in 1588 ended in disaster when the Spanish Armada was destroyed. By 1440, Portugal broke away, followed by uprisings in Catalonia and Naples. The empire that had seemed eternal just decades earlier was fragmenting. Spanish industry withered because nobles considered commerce beneath their dignity, and the most talented workers were expelled when Jews and Muslims were forced to convert or leave. The nation that possessed the world's greatest treasure became Europe's economic invalid, a cautionary tale about confusing money with wealth. Future empires would study Spanish decline and promise to learn from its mistakes, but the temptation to take monetary shortcuts proved irresistible.
Britain's paper promise empire. Britain learned from Spain's mistakes and built its empire differently. Rather than seeking gold mines, Britain focused on trade, manufacturing, and naval supremacy. The British East India Company became the world's most powerful corporation, controlling trade with Asia. British factories produced textiles that undersold competitors, and British merchants financed global commerce through sophisticated banking. The pound sterling became the world's reserve currency, trusted from London to Calcutta. But empires are expensive, and Britain's reach eventually exceeded its grasp. The costs of fighting Napoleon, maintaining the Royal Navy, and administering colonies from Canada to Australia strained even Britain's productive economy. The solution was financial innovation. Britain developed a complex system of paper money, government bonds, and central banking that allowed spending beyond immediate tax revenue. During World War I, Britain borrowed astronomical sums to fund its military while suspending the gold standard that had previously limited money creation. Citizens were encouraged to buy war bonds with the promise of repayment with interest. The Bank of England printed pounds to cover government expenses, and the money supply expanded rapidly. After the war, Britain faced a dilemma. It had promised bondholders repayment in gold-backed pounds at pre-war value, but doing so would require either massive tax increases or severe deflation. The government chose a middle path of muddling through, returning to the gold standard at the old rate in 1925 despite changed economic circumstances. This decision, championed by Winston Churchill as Chancellor of the Exchequer, proved disastrous. British exports became overpriced compared to competitors, unemployment soared, and the economy stagnated. Meanwhile, the costs of empire continued mounting. Independence movements gained strength in India and other colonies, requiring expensive military responses. World War II broke Britain's finances completely. The sterling crisis and imperial retreat. By 1945, Britain owed staggering debts to the United States and could barely feed its own population without American aid. The empire that had ruled a quarter of the world's population was bankrupt. The pound, once the pillar of global finance, required American loans to maintain its value. Britain tried desperately to preserve both its currency value and its empire, but the two goals proved incompatible. Maintaining overseas military bases, subsidizing colonies, and projecting power globally required spending Britain simply could not afford. The government printed money to cover expenses, leading to inflation that eroded living standards at home. Workers demanded higher wages to keep pace with rising prices, and businesses raised prices to cover higher labor costs. This wage price spiral accelerated throughout the 1950s and 1960s.
British governments of both parties tried various solutions. They imposed price and wage controls, nationalized industries, and borrowed from international institutions. Nothing worked because the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Britain was spending beyond its productive capacity and printing money to cover the difference. In 1976, Prime Minister Harold Wilson was forced to devalue the pound by 14%, a humiliating admission that British currency had been overvalued. Wilson went on television to assure citizens that the pound in their pockets had not been devalued, which was technically true but misleading since imported goods would now cost more. The 1970s brought even worse crisis. Oil price shocks combined with domestic inflation to create stagflation, a supposedly impossible combination of high inflation and high unemployment. Interest rates soared over 15% and the pound collapsed in value. In 1976, Britain was forced to seek a humiliating bailout from the International Monetary Fund, accepting strict conditions on government spending. The empire had dissolved, with India, Pakistan, African colonies, and other territories gaining independence. Britain maintained illusions of great power status through its nuclear weapons and permanent United Nations Security Council seat, but economic reality told a different story. The nation that had invented the Industrial Revolution and ruled the world's oceans had been brought low by the same currency collapse pattern that destroyed Rome and Spain. America's rise and the dollar's dominance. As Britain declined, the United States ascended to become the 20th century superpower. America's rise was built on genuine productive capacity. American factories outproduced all competitors, American farms fed much of the world, and American innovation led in technology from automobiles to electronics. The dollar replaced the pound as the global reserve currency, and the Bretton Woods system made the dollar as good as gold, with foreign governments able to exchange dollars for gold at $35 per ounce. This arrangement gave America enormous privilege. When other nations ran trade deficits, they had to either earn more or borrow carefully. When America ran deficits, it simply printed more dollars that the world was obliged to accept. American living standards rose year after year during the post-war boom. A single income could support a middle-class family with a house, car, and annual vacation. Manufacturing jobs paid well enough to build wealth. But maintaining global dominance proved expensive for America just as it had for Rome, Spain, and Britain. The Vietnam War cost billions, the arms race with the Soviet Union demanded constant military spending, and social programs expanded dramatically. President Lyndon Johnson promised both guns and butter, funding the Great Society welfare programs while escalating war in Southeast Asia. The Federal Reserve printed money to help finance these commitments, and America's gold reserves began flowing overseas as foreign governments exchanged dollars for gold. By 1971, President Richard Nixon faced the same dilemma as his Roman and British predecessors. Honoring the gold commitment would require either cutting spending drastically or raising taxes substantially, both politically unpalatable options. Instead, Nixon closed the gold window, declaring that the United States would no longer exchange dollars for gold. This decision, intended as temporary, became permanent. For the first time in history, the world's reserve currency was backed by nothing except trust in the American government. The temptation of infinite money. Removing the gold standard eliminated the main constraint on money creation. Previously, if the government printed too many dollars, foreign governments would demand gold and reserves would disappear. Now, there was no such check. The Federal Reserve could create dollars at will, limited only by concerns about inflation and currency value. At first, the consequences seemed manageable. Inflation rose during the 1970s, reaching levels that shocked Americans accustomed to stable prices, but the economy adapted. Then came Paul Volcker, Federal Reserve Chairman from 1979 to 1987, who raised interest rates above 20% to crush inflation. The medicine worked, but caused severe pain, with unemployment exceeding 10% and businesses failing in droves. Once inflation was controlled, a new era began. Government debt, which had been relatively modest and declining as a percentage of the economy, began growing steadily. Each president and Congress promised fiscal responsibility, but then added to the debt. Republicans cut taxes while maintaining spending, and Democrats increased spending while maintaining services. Both parties supported military expansion after the September 11th attacks, launching expensive wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The 2008 financial crisis brought unprecedented monetary experimentation. Major banks faced collapse, threatening to drag down the entire financial system. The Federal Reserve responded with bailouts and a new policy called quantitative easing, essentially creating trillions of dollars to purchase bonds and prop up asset prices. Critics warned this was currency debasement by another name, but supporters argued that modern economies required such interventions. The national debt exploded from $10 trillion before the crisis to over $20 trillion by 2020. Then came the COVID-19 pandemic, triggering even more dramatic responses. The government sent checks to citizens, expanded unemployment benefits, and subsidized businesses. The Federal Reserve bought bonds at unprecedented rates, expanding its balance sheet to over $8 trillion. In just 2 years, America created more money than in the previous 2 centuries. Politicians assured citizens that modern monetary theory meant deficits didn't matter, that a government issuing its own currency could never go bankrupt, and that inflation was outdated thinking.
The warning signs flash red. By 2021, inflation returned with a vengeance. Prices for groceries, gasoline, housing, and nearly everything else began rising at rates not seen since the 1970s. The Federal Reserve initially dismissed the increases as transitory, claiming they resulted from temporary supply chain disruptions. But inflation persisted and accelerated, reaching 9% in 2022, the highest in 4 decades. Americans watched their purchasing power erode as wages failed to keep pace with rising costs. $1 in 2020 bought significantly less in 2024. Retirees on fixed incomes struggled as their savings lost value, and young families found home ownership increasingly unaffordable. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates aggressively, trying to cool inflation without causing recession. The national debt, now exceeding $34 trillion, became harder to service as interest rates rose. Interest payments on the debt consumed an increasing share of the federal budget, crowding out other priorities. Meanwhile, international confidence in the dollar began showing cracks. China, Russia, and other nations started conducting trade in alternative currencies, reducing dollar usage. Central banks diversified their reserves, holding less in dollars and more in gold, euros, and yuan. The percentage of global reserves held in dollars declined from over 70% in 2000 to below 60% and falling. Some economists dismissed these concerns, noting that predictions of dollar collapse had been wrong many times before. The dollar remained dominant, they argued, because no alternative could match America's deep financial markets and stable institutions. But others saw the historical pattern repeating. Rome debased its coins gradually until suddenly the empire collapsed. Spain's treasure fleets arrived regularly until suddenly they stopped. Britain's pound seemed eternal until suddenly it was not. These collapses looked impossible until they became inevitable, and the transition from stability to crisis happened faster than most expected. The social and political consequences. Currency collapse is never just about economics. When money fails, society itself begins to fracture. Americans increasingly feel the system is rigged against ordinary people, while benefiting the wealthy and connected. Asset price inflation from money creation enriches those who own stocks and real estate, while harming those dependent on wages and savings. A family that bought a house decades ago sees their net worth soar, while young people struggle to afford homes despite working full-time jobs. This generational divide breeds resentment. Political polarization intensifies as citizens lose faith in institutions. Some blame immigrants, others blame corporations, and still others blame government incompetence. Few recognize that monetary policy might be the underlying cause of their frustration. Conspiracy theories flourish when official explanations do not match lived experience. If the government claims inflation is temporary while grocery bills keep rising, people stop trusting government statements. If economists insist the economy is strong while families cannot afford rent, people stop trusting economists. This collapse of trust mirrors what happened in late Rome when citizens refused debased coins, or in Spain when merchants demanded payment in foreign currency, or in Britain when workers went on strike because wages bought less each year. Social cohesion depends on shared prosperity and belief in a better future. When currency debasement erodes both, societies become vulnerable to demagogues promising simple solutions to complex problems. History shows that economic crisis often precedes political upheaval. Rome's currency collapse preceded its fragmentation into warring factions. Spain's inflation fueled rebellions across its empire. Britain's economic decline accompanied the loss of its colonies and global influence. America now faces similar stresses with increasing political violence, declining life expectancy, crumbling infrastructure, and growing wealth inequality. Can the pattern be broken? The currency collapse formula is not inevitable destiny, but rather the result of specific choices.
Empires face expensive commitments and insufficient revenue, then choose to debase currency rather than make hard decisions about priorities. This choice provides temporary relief, but guarantees long-term disaster. Could America choose differently? Some economists advocate returning to sound money principles, either through a new gold standard or through constitutional limits on money creation. They argue that constraining government spending would force necessary prioritization and prevent the debasement that destroyed previous empires. Critics respond that modern economies require flexible monetary policy and that rigid standards would cause unnecessary unemployment and suffering. Others propose that technology might break the pattern. Cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin, offer alternatives to government-issued money with supply limited by mathematics rather than political decisions. If citizens can opt out of debased currency, perhaps governments would face market discipline that prevents collapse. Skeptics note that cryptocurrencies remain volatile and impractical for everyday use, and that governments are unlikely to surrender monetary control voluntarily. A third perspective suggests that America's situation differs fundamentally from Rome, Spain, and Britain. Those empires eventually lost productive capacity and became dependent on others, but America remains innovative and productive. The dollar dominates because the American economy produces goods and services the world wants, not just because of military power. As long as that remains true, the dollar can survive challenges that destroyed lesser currencies. Yet this argument ignores how Rome was productive until currency debasement weakened it, how Spain possessed immense resources until inflation destroyed its economy, and how Britain led the Industrial Revolution until monetary mismanagement squandered that advantage. Productive capacity can be lost if currency collapse undermines the economic system. The choice facing America is stark. Either restore fiscal discipline and sound monetary policy, accepting lower government spending and potential short-term economic pain, or continue down the path of deficit spending and money creation, hoping that somehow the historical pattern will not repeat. Every previous empire in this situation convinced itself that it was different, that it could manage currency debasement better than its predecessors, that catastrophe would not strike this time.
The final reckoning. Throughout history, currency collapse has followed a predictable sequence. First comes the temptation, when leaders face expensive commitments and discover they can create money rather than raise taxes or cut spending. Second comes the rationalization, when economists and officials explain why this time is different, why the old rules no longer apply, why concerns about debasement are outdated thinking. Third comes the acceleration, when initial money creation causes problems that leaders address by creating even more money, entering a spiral that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. Fourth comes the crisis, when citizens lose confidence in the currency and the entire system threatens to collapse. Finally comes the reckoning, when society must rebuild on sounder foundations, usually after tremendous suffering and disruption. Rome took centuries to complete this cycle, Spain about 200 years, and Britain roughly 100 years. The process seems to accelerate with each iteration as financial systems become more complex and interconnected. America has been on this path for approximately 50 years since abandoning the gold standard in 1971. If the pattern holds, the crisis stage approaches. What would currency collapse look like in modern America? Perhaps not the dramatic hyperinflation of Weimar Germany with wheelbarrows of worthless bills, but rather a gradual erosion punctuated by sudden shocks. Inflation persisting at elevated levels year after year, slowly destroying savings and fixed incomes. International rejection of the dollar accelerating as other nations lose confidence, forcing America to pay higher interest rates to borrow. A debt spiral where rising interest costs consume more of the budget, requiring even more borrowing, leading to even higher rates. Eventually, a crisis moment when markets refuse to lend at any reasonable rate, forcing immediate and drastic spending cuts combined with high inflation. The empire that seemed eternal suddenly finds itself unable to maintain commitments, forced to withdraw from military bases worldwide, unable to pay promised Social Security and Medicare benefits, watching its standard of living decline sharply. This outcome is not certain, but increasingly probable if current policies continue. The mathematics of compounding debt and the lessons of history both point toward crisis unless dramatic policy changes occur. The choice between history and hope. The currency collapse formula connects Rome to Spain to Britain to America through a chain of monetary debasement that transcends cultures, centuries, and continents.
Each empire believed itself exceptional, immune to the fate of its predecessors, sophisticated enough to manage currency manipulation without consequences. Each discovered too late that economic laws operate regardless of military might or cultural achievements. The pattern reveals fundamental truth about human nature and political economy. Leaders naturally prefer easy solutions over hard choices, spending over taxing, creating money over cutting programs. Citizens demand services but resist paying for them, and politicians win elections by promising both. The temptation to debase currency provides relief from this impossible bind, letting governments spend without immediate consequences. But the bill always comes due, sometimes within years, sometimes within decades, but always inevitably. America now stands where Rome stood when emperors first added copper to silver coins, where Spain stood when treasure fleets first arrived from Potosi, where Britain stood when it first suspended the gold standard. The early stages feel manageable, even beneficial, as new money stimulates activity and finances priorities that otherwise would be impossible. The costs remain hidden, in gradual inflation and distant debt. But the formula has never been broken. Every empire that debased its currency eventually paid the price in economic ruin, social disorder, and political collapse. America retains advantages its predecessors lacked, including technological sophistication, educational institutions, military power, and natural resources. Yet none of these advantages can overcome mathematical reality if currency debasement continues. The question is not whether the pattern will repeat, but when and how severely. Will America recognize the warning signs and change course, accepting short-term sacrifice to preserve long-term stability? Or will it continue printing money, expanding debt, and hoping that somehow the ancient formula has lost its power? The answer will determine not just America's fate, but the shape of global civilization for generations to come. Because when the world's reserve currency collapses, no nation remains unaffected. History has written this story before, always ending in catastrophe. Whether the current chapter concludes differently depends on choices being made right now. Choices about spending and money creation, about priorities and sacrifice, about learning from history or repeating it once more with terrible consequences.